YOLO composing gloves here, and this is a book update. So before we were sitting around 40 pages, it's now 167 pages. It's getting bigger than I thought at first. And it's not like just like I'm trying to fill it up either. These are like things I spend a long time thinking about. Like I think it's been like a month, but I've been working on this like crazy. It's been one of my main focuses. I think about this thing all the time, and I get distracted from doing my official studies because I'm always working on this. So I've reread and edited certain chapters, thinking, nah, there's better ways to say this. There's more efficient ways to say this. There's things that are left out that I wish weren't left out. So all these things, I've got this big aspiration to write like the best possible book on the topic. And so it just takes a lot of time. But anyways, last time. So what are the major updates? Well, first, this is a working copy. So there's things that say like insert questions here. So I really take my time when I think of questions. I want good questions, and I don't want too many questions. I want things that are like real, genuine, and matter, and are worth doing. So some of them, I believe, from the chapter on structure on, do not have questions yet. A lot of links are still not there. I want to cross-reference to as many additional sources as possible. And pictures are yet to be updated in some sections. There's one picture in particular I'd like to change, and lots of pictures and things will be added to help visual learners and give other ways of thinking about it. And oftentimes this yields to me rewriting certain sections because it ends up working out better. Just depends. And making some of these charts and graphs just takes a long time. So I've gotten a lot better at Excel ever since I started this, ironically. So anyways, let's go ahead. Let's look at the chapters that I've added. So I've reworked this list to include more along the lines of what I want to do. The beginning starts out a lot more with fundamentals, and then as we get going, there'll be more and more application as we go. So some of you guys will want to skip around. Others of you will, read through it thoroughly, line by line, whatever floats your boat. It's meant to be a book you can read through, but at the same time, a book you can pick up the info you need. So what is sound? Map of sound. Structural analysis was not all the way completed. Now we've gone all the way through it, and there's still some sections I need to add questions and pictures and links, but the material for the most part is there. And the same thing for the DB and RMS. I still need to add music notation. This originally was going to be an appendix, but it ended up being so important that I'm just going to make it a full-on chapter. And that's where we're sitting at right now. And then I've also added on the appendixes. So these are things that are supplementary. You don't need to know these things, but if you do, they will put you ahead. And if you don't know these things, you may fail to understand important principles. So, and some of these things I also preface with, this is gonna go deep. This is not a basic thing, but it's something I wish had been somewhere in front of me so that I knew that this was a thing, and if I wanted to learn it, I could go at it. And so, for example, frequency and phase start out nice, but eventually you wind up in calculus. RMS, you wind up in calculus. So these are things that you might understand the beginning parts and then understand up to a point, and then after that, you'll probably have to go and study math or another subject to get you ready to understand further principles. And this is just the way learning is, Eventually, you're gonna have to learn a couple other subjects to enhance your ability to learn the thing you really want to know. This is what I've learned as I've studied. So I've also included a section on units, which is, I really like this section. I've been working on it for ages though, like really trying to clarify the assumptions that we make with units and trying to draw the line because I want to be as correct as possible. And this is pretty hard to do, balancing classical physics and special relativity, which I know it sounds ridiculous because this is a sound synth basics book. But you'd be surprised what the implications of units are in every field ever. It's actually kind of important. And again, this is just an appendix, so it's not in the main body. But these are things that fascinate me, and I can see how they're related. And not a lot of people always see that. So I think it's worth having in here. And I love writing about it. So it's in the appendix if you want to know. So let's go ahead. Let's just go through every chapter real quick. I'll explain what it's about, and then we'll move on from there. So amplitude, last time we got up to phase, and now you can see we've got pictures and links all over the place, and I've really thought about how we're going to say things. Some of this is a little more mathy than I really but I don't really know any other way to really explain it. But I try to be as straightforward as possible, because when you're looking at signals and we talk about signals, you kind of need to know what these things are. If you want to, if you're going to be working technically in a field where a microphone placement will do a phase shift, you don't know what phase is, you're going to have problems. So I know some of you guys will be like, why do I need to know this? It's going to matter. It will matter eventually. Right now, though, it forms the fundamentals. When you're learning the fundamentals, it can be frustrating sometimes. You don't see how it works. I try to list a lot of examples. For example, I list speakers and how moving speakers matters and how it causes phase shifts. I don't talk about standing waves and stuff necessarily. We talk about interference and other units of audio processing units or effects that rely on it, and vector scope. So we talk about audio related things. I try to be as application-y as possible for those of you who only care about application and could care less about theory, which is most audio engineers. But the theory is what makes it work. So I try to keep it as interesting as possible and relate things. So we go through here, we talk about the 5 components of music. This is a whole big section, and these things are so massive in their reach that what I try to do is give you if you were to discover it, how would it happen kind of approach. So if you're in a cave and you got teleported back in time hundreds of years, would you have what it takes to rediscover everything? Because a lot of people will teach you material in a way that does not enable you to be as creative as possible. It does not enable you to discover the material for yourself. That is the worst way to teach, in my opinion. When someone teaches, you should be able to realize, oh my gosh, that's what this is, and that's what this is, and it should enter your mind and be organic and come out of you. And like, a great teacher, when students are asking questions that are reaching ahead of what the teacher's thinking, organic thoughts, revelation happening in class, that's what I'm aiming for in the book. So for example, on harmony, that's like a massive topic with a lot of potholes. So instead, what I try to do, because it requires so much memorization and lots of study to really learn it, I asked myself, what is the big problem with the way most harmony classes are taught? And then the big problem is most harmony students have no idea what they're talking about in general. They don't understand the in general thought process that makes harmony work. Harmony, a lot of students are confused on what harmony really even is. Like, a lot of them will give answers like, it's when you play 2 notes at the same time, it forms a harmony. These answers are correct, but they're not the full answer. There's things that they're missing. There's lots of things that I could begin to tear apart your definition and say, what about this? What about that? Is this harmony? Is that harmony? If we got a bunch of people together and all sing notes and had them slowly get out of tune, at what point would the harmony disappear? Come on, let's talk about this thing. So I really try to do that. Harmony is the perception of frequency, and this brings up all kinds of interesting questions, and that's a really easy thing to say. So I say those sorts of things, and then we work from there. We talk about systems of harmony and why one school of thought happened versus another, where atonality came from. Why is that an idea? We stick with the basics, but I give you overarching ideas, and then I talk about the logic of it. For example, when you're learning math, there's a certain way you learn math, and you learn certain principles, and there's a real logic to the learning of the subject. And I bring that over to harmony, because if you can understand that, it makes the subject as a whole really easy to see why something's important, and it also makes it easier to learn the subject. Most students who really struggle have no idea why they're learning that in the first place, and that's why they're not getting it. And it's the major problem in almost every subject. Like, teachers just make too many assumptions, and they ask you to invest too much faith without fully explaining why something is necessary, why a step is necessary. So that's what these are all trying to do. The most important one of these is probably structure. These aren't necessarily in order. Maybe I'll adjust them to be in order. There's structure, I believe, is the last one. But structure is such a general thing. And this is the thing, I've talked to a lot of professors about these 5 topics. And I ask them, what do you think makes all music? And I've gotten a lot of really interesting answers. And I've gotten a lot of what I call partially, they're 100% correct, but they're not the full answer. So they're partially correct. So for example, they'll say melody instead of theme, which is a subcategory of theme. What about lyrics? What about things that are ideas, but they're not necessarily melodies, but they still form a theme? So things like that were all talked about in here. Some people, especially those who have really thought about music and like what it is, will find a lot of this. You might be going, why is this necessary to learn? Well, if you sit down to write music, the more ideas you have to work with, the more effective you'll be, the more you can communicate, the more deliberate you can be. Being inspired is great, and you can totally be inspired, but having ideas to help you be inspired is just a tremendous step forward in being able to express yourself. Like, you know, when you like people's talking, we're talking in a language right now, we're talking in English, and I'm able to express myself through all my knowledge of English. And if I just was like waiting to be inspired about English and didn't go out and learn new words and learn new thoughts, my ability to express myself would be limited. So in the same way, this is something, so these things are valuable things. So anyways, let's scroll down here. So that's sort of what's going on here. I also make a series of claims about these 5 components of music. And I feel that it's important to justify these things. So first we explain what everything is. I give you as organic an approach as I can using all the methods. Like here's some old notation, just some really cool stuff. And we come down here and we go through harmony and the justification of claims happens through structural analysis. Justification and claims. So I justify what all my claims are. I think it's important that you understand that there are arguments I have for why these things are the way they are. They're not just things I think, there are reasons for this. So those things are here. Some of you guys will really be into it, some of you won't. It just depends on what kind of piques your interest. And finally, we're coming up here. Well, not finally, we're just getting started, right? Talk about the 6 aspects of sound, which is actually an explanation for claim 5. And we go through, we talk about what does it mean to say a sound is long or a sound is short, and why is this useful in composition? It's actually one of the more useful techniques you can have, because if you can understand this, you can objectively move towards any kind of goal, really. And when you talk with artists, almost all artists talk in aspects rather than in like pretty solid terms, like, oh, I wanted that to be twice as loud here, or that or the other. Well, they might say something that's specific, but you'll get artists who say like, I want things to sound blue, or I want the wind to sound like it's crying in this song. Like just weird things that they want. And they're used to talking in this sort of language. And so understanding this sort of language and what they're doing without realizing it can be really helpful towards resolving conversations. There's been a couple times where I've seen engineers get angry at musicians for being so dang ambiguous about what they want, where if you just knew how to explore aspects of sound, you'd be better equipped to talk to people who have a less technical background, but philosophically understand what they want. So anyways, that's what this section, it's not that long of a section. Questions don't exist yet because questions will be added. Also notice that there's like no links at this point, or pictures. This might be one that has just less of those things because it's really more of an idea kind of thing. But I really try to get as many resources as possible. DBRMS, I could say a lot about this, but I've been kind of talking for a little bit, so I think I might wrap it up. But anyways, the DB, these are topics that I just was severely underwhelmed at what books and instructors, how they taught this, because it wasn't taught, like they just make too many assumptions. The DB is a unitless thing. That was never clearly explained to me. What was clearly explained was the ratios. Everyone just preaches about the ratios, but then they never show you, well, at least I wasn't showing, and including in the books, I was never justified as to why these ratios worked the way they did. And look at this. Oh yeah, and this is nothing. They never explained what a bell was in the first place. Like that, like what even is a freaking bell? Like, can you please tell me what that is? So like we talk about that. And also sound power is left out of almost every discussion I've ever seen, including most online articles, unless they're specifically acoustics articles. They're the people who actually, define these things. You kind of have to know these things so that there's a difference between sound power and sound pressure and what these differences are. In fact, in one of my acoustics courses I took, they didn't distinguish this. And it was an intro course. Like, So, you know, there are things that I was kind of like, and some of it was they were scared to talk about math at students. And to me, it's like, no, there are ways to talk about this that are not overwhelming and it was, and should be required, because how are you supposed to talk about these ideas without this? So, and I've seen what they've tried to do to talk about the ideas without it. It just didn't work. It just left me more frustrated than anything, because now you've got a bunch of things that you think are true, but you have no way of knowing if they really are true, other than you went through a class for it and some teacher told you it was true, and they gave you a book that also skipped steps, so you couldn't even understand your book. You know, you can tell I was kind of scarred by this process, but I've come out of the fray a victor. So we talk about pressure, the units of pressure, things of that nature, and I really try to be as transparent as possible. If the logs scare you, I explain logs right here, and if you take your time, and I even have a video for it, and there's lots of videos. If you take your time, it's not a difficult concept. You can completely understand it. I promise you, just take some time to learn it. It'll make your ability to understand decibel so much easier. So, and I even have 2 big ways of explaining it. In the appendix, I take a completely different approach, which some of you guys might just get completely lost if you're not used to thinking theoretically, but other people will find it extremely enlightening. My mind was blown. I found a way even in the process to compute logs by hand, stumbled across it online, and it made so much sense, so I had to share it with you. And then there's the really intuitive way, which is the way the video approaches it and things. So the things that I think are more intuitive, I generally keep in the sections. The appendix is for like the deeper stuff. So anyways, come through here, talk about logs, give you several resources that you could go to use to check out logs a little bit better if math isn't your strongest suit or it's been a while, or you just don't know at all about this stuff. These are great places to start. Logs aren't something that you need to wait to learn. You really could. If you know how to count and multiply, you can talk about logs. So we have units, and so this unit has sort of inspired me to write the appendix thing on it. So I have an appendix on units, which I'll talk about when we get there. So these are sort of the units that matter to you if you really want to know units, which is an incredibly enlightening subject. It's so fascinating, but we just don't talk about it that much because most books just want to get to what they have to talk about. The units are incredible. So you can check it out, because numbers and units and things, those are technologies that are being improved. Like, they just voted on 4 of the base SI units. They really actually changed all 7. A lot of things were defined, well, everything was defined with cesium, of all things. It's called the cesium standard. Anyways, there's some fascinating stuff going on there. So I just got a lot of thoughts going on in my head, because you know, I can only write so much out of the portion that you have to go through just to think about what you want to write. But we talk about sound pressure, intensity level, what all these things are, what they're defined as. There's some math, but I really try to be as clear as possible. And if you come through here, by the end, you'll have a true understanding of, you know, what you're talking about when you say SPL and you say sound power and things of this nature. There's some unit stuff going on here that if you take the time to learn it, it's really actually pretty clear what we're saying. We have some pretty specific ways of saying this. We talk about inverse square laws, pressure, the different kinds of pressure. We even make up our own unit just to show you how units are just there to be used. You can make up your own if you need to. Now, this is just an example to sort of get you used to working with units. In this case, it's a specific example about pressure. So anyways, talk about newtons, what a newton is. And this is all needed to understand all the various versions of the decibel, since the decibel can have many different types, since the units simplify out of a decibel. So we talk about pressure and this approximation, pretty interesting thing that for whatever reason was not talked about in my classes, but it was needed for the higher classes. So it was one of those things where your lower professor didn't talk about it, but your higher professor, meaning higher and more advanced classes, required you to already know about it. So I felt like I got hoodwinked on some of these things. Talk about the derivation for the logs and their powers and why they are that way. Like 6 dB correlates to a doubling in voltage. Why is that? Well, the proofs in some books skip a lot of steps. I don't, and I try to justify things as much as possible as I go through. So we go through here, we do some clear examples, like here's more of the application, like a trumpet player comes in, they play 73 dB, another trumpet player comes in, he plays 73 dB. How much louder did he get? They're dB SPL, sort of implied by the situation. And how much louder did it get? And it did not get 146 dB loud. Like, it did not go up to that level. That's really, really loud. Like, your ears will be bleeding loud. Like, that's how loud. The threshold of pain has been crossed at that point. So we talked about that. We derive it and explain why they are the way that it is. Why does it only increase that much, as opposed to saying, look, it's a shockingly low amount and move on? No, we talk about why that is, so that you have an intuition, so you can judge scenarios a lot better. So we come through here, do all these things. Look at how great that is. Look at graph. It's a shockingly few graphs. I really didn't go crazy. The types of dB. Some of these types of dB require knowledge of units, like the dB watt, the dB full scale. These things are things, this is in like all your DAWs. dB full scale is a thing, and understanding what exactly it's measuring is really important, because I've seen several videos that have talked about dB full scale, and they I don't want to talk about it. Okay, so we're moving on, but they were somewhat frustrating because they slip these little lies in so smoothly. They totally sound true, but they're just not true. I've seen even professors occasionally do this just because they have technical knowledge in other areas and they're explaining this area for some reason. And yeah, so just be careful. Back up with other resources and stuff. Make sure it's actually true. Anyway, talk about that. The dB volt. Some people call it dB big V, dB small v, dBm, and the dBu, and why all these things are the way they are, and why do we even use voltage in the first place, huh? Why isn't it? That was never answered in any of my courses. I never thought to ask it until later. So I'm sure someone could have answered it, but pretty interesting question. And so I go through here and explain, what voltage is and why it's used. And there's actually a lot of links to circuits that I avoid for the most part, just because it gets deep fast. So there you go. Look, there's a VU meter. How fascinating is that? And we go through. We got the dBA, dBb, and dBc. There's no dBb meter on this. They've got a Z weighting, which I thought was interesting, instead of including the B weighting. But I've also got some links to where these pictures come from, so you can check out the site, because usually I have a lot of good info on there. Talk about the standards, meters. RMS is given a short little bit. RMS, you don't need to really understand how RMS comes about to really use it. You can see it just as an average, but knowing why it works the way it does is kind of important, I think. So maybe I just contradicted myself. So that's why there's a section on here in it. I think it is important to know about. The appendix, though, goes into a little more detail, but you can sort of look at it as an average and survive. That's what a lot of people do. That's what I did when I started. But it's really nice to know what you're actually talking about. And the appendix goes into more of the calculus version. So then the questions don't exist yet. And then the appendixes, you go into frequency and phase, and what really is frequency, what really is phase. And if you take waves and optics, you get much more thorough answers than what you would get typically. And so I take some of that and introduce it here. Some of the philosophy also that goes behind it. So that's this section. There's also this weird constant that I found fascinating. So if you read this and know more about this weird constant, do enlighten me. The RMS, and so this is like the RMS in a approximated form, and then we can talk about the calculus versions of it, which can give exact answers if you know the function. We have calculating logs and logs by hand, and also an explanation of our bases for counting systems, which can be a really fascinating topic. These are all appendix topics. And then, like, here's the by hand thing. It looks crazy, but if you have a calculator, you don't write any of this out. You just start going and start approximating your answer as you go. I was surprised at this method. It was amazing to me. There's a proof offered where I originally learned it, and it took me a while to understand the proof, just because there were some symbols in there I'd never seen before. Because the guy who wrote it used really formal writing to do it. Anyways, there's this here. Very interesting if you're into that sort of thing. And then units, and we start with numbers and 1 and talk about why the number 1 as a unit makes all these ridiculous claims. And it's very, very interesting as you begin to learn more about this. A lot of people who I show this to have never thought about some of these things, and they really make you realize there's a lot of assumptions we have that are part of the reason why there are some questions we simply can't answer because of the assumptions we've made. And if you ever read Gödel, Bach, and Eternal Golden Braid, the exact reason why this is the case is actually outlined there in like the first 5 or so chapters. That's sort of denser reading though, but it's a thing on formal systems. At least the first part of the book is very intriguing. And we talk about the other properties of one, and this is all necessary because we're going to be talking about a unit. We got to know what a unit is before we can start talking about it. We go through a little bit of like coming up with what units are, why the units are, and our base assumptions about the universe can basically be seen as just the 7 units that we have. And then here's what they're sort of trying to measure, and here's what they are as far as like what we've named them in their symbols. And then we have number prefixes. I had to talk about this because can't just assume you know this. This to me is sort of stuff people kind of already know, but they might not be familiar with it. I also skipped sig figs, so I'm not worrying about significant figures here. I think I might bring it up occasionally, like once or twice. We talk about scientific notation briefly. I'm really used to working in scientific notation. Like I'll try and work usually in the base units and then use scientific notation, and then only worry about simplifying down to some other unit. If everything's already in millis, then I just stay in milli. That's what everyone does. Hey, if you do this stuff, you know what I'm talking about. Length in the meter, we talk about, each unit and what their assumptions are and why they are what they are. And they're really pretty fascinating. And you'll also understand a lot more jokes. Like there's the joke that, here's Newton's equation for the law of gravity. And then Coulomb came along and basically changed G to K and M to Q, M1 to Q1 and M2 to Q2. And people are always like, oh, can I copy your homework? And but just change it a little. And so he changed it a little. I see those comments occasionally. They're funny. So you can see that sort of stuff here. Anyways, I've been talking for like a lot longer, but I've done so much work on this. I'm really excited to share it with someone. I've also included these quotes. Basically, if I find a quote and I think it's cool and I think it could sort of fit here, I put it in here. For example, today, this was from Anonymous. I think it's just a saying, but it said, doubt is the precursor to fear. I thought that was really powerful. So some of these things don't necessarily directly relate, but there's music ones in here. This was an old professor that I had. He was always dropping one-liners left and right. He sort of monologued when he started lecturing. He's retired now. And then there's some funny, inspirational sort of ones, like Lagrange to Newton of some of the accidents that led to many of Newton's explanations. Such accidents come only to those who deserve them. It's kind of, thought-provoking. Like, am I really trying here? I'm terrified to start the glossary because defining words as I think they really ought to be can be, because there's word definitions already, but sometimes those word definitions just aren't quite there all the way. The person who came up with the definition, there's a certain amount of respect you got to have, but there's also a certain amount of questioning you've got to do. Ask, is this really the case? So the glossary might be a bit different than a glossary most people are used to. It's going to be more similar to the philosophy glossaries in the philosophy textbooks I have. They don't settle for the dictionary definitions. They go out of their way on some to basically write whole pages just to explain why this word actually technically means these things if you look at it from a certain way, and these things if you look at it from another way. So the glossary will be an interesting development. Right now I'm more focused on adding material, and I'm really glad to sort of be done with this. Explaining things like resistance was more difficult than I anticipated it being, so I didn't want to get too crazy, but I didn't want to skimp out on things either. And there's some of these things were never explained to me in terms of units. We always just sort of used them. So I really wanted to explain why they are what they are. So anyways, that is Sound and Synth Basics book update. It's a lot. There's even more. I feel like I could just give these big lectures on every single section because I've been thinking about them so much. Sound is fascinating. If you have any questions, let me know. Subscribe and have a blessed